Hello and welcome. Tonight we will gently explore the fascinating world of psychology, neuroscience and behavior. As you settle into comfort, you can allow your mind to drift softly. You don't need to focus on every word. It's okay to just relax and let the words wash over you. This is a peaceful journey through how our minds work and how we learn, remember and relate to the world around us. Even if you drift in and out of listening, that's perfectly fine. The ideas will flow calmly and repeat softly now and then, so they can settle naturally into your subconscious as you unwind. Let's begin at the very beginning, in a quiet and curious state of mind, by thinking about how we come to understand the mind itself. Psychology is the study of the mind and behavior, and over the years, people have tried to study it carefully and scientifically. Imagine a researcher, perhaps late at night in a softly lit library, pondering a question about why people act or feel the way they do. They start with a theory, a gentle idea, or a hunch about how something might work. It's like having a thoughtful insight that tries to explain some part of our experience. From that idea, the researcher forms a hypothesis, which is just a more specific, testable prediction stemming from the theory. It's as if they say, I suspect this might be true, and I will check it in this particular way. The hypothesis is like a little seed of curiosity planted in the rich soil of scientific exploration. In the calm pursuit of understanding, the researcher then decides on a method to test this hypothesis. There are different ways to learn about the mind. Sometimes they quietly observe people in real-world settings, other times they conduct controlled experiments in a lab, or they may ask people questions through interviews and surveys. Each method offers clues. Observation can show natural behavior, experiments can reveal cause and effect, and surveys can gather many voices. By choosing the appropriate method and gathering data systematically, the researcher can begin to discern patterns and relationships. As our researcher carries out the chosen study, whether watching behavior, running an experiment, or listening to people's answers, they gather data. This could be notes about what happened, measurements of responses, or records of what people said. Once they have these bits of knowledge, it's time to make sense of them. In a reflective, unhurried manner, they analyze the data. This might involve simple tallies or looking at averages, or more complex steps like using statistical tests to see if any patterns are meaningful or just due to chance. The researcher is asking, did what I predicted actually happen? Was there really a difference or an effect? Or was it merely random? If the results suggest a clear pattern, for instance that people who slept longer did perform better on a memory test, the researcher will feel more confident that their initial hunch was onto something. If not, that's okay too. It guides them to refine their ideas. Throughout, the researcher has to be careful to avoid biases. For instance, expecting a certain outcome might unconsciously influence how they interpret results. To prevent that, studies are often done blind. Participants might not know if they're receiving a real treatment or a placebo, and sometimes even the researchers interacting with participants don't know a double-blind design. This way, expectations on either side can't shape the findings, and any effect observed is more likely to be genuine. Researchers also stay mindful of chance findings. They use statistical tools to help determine if the patterns they see are likely to be real, or if they could have happened by coincidence. If the analysis shows an outcome is very unlikely to be mere chance, often using a threshold like 5% probability, they call it a significant result. After analysing the data, the researcher reflects on what it all means. They share their findings, perhaps in a gentle summary or report, allowing other curious minds to learn from it or even try to replicate the study. Over time, if many careful studies point to the same conclusion, our understanding becomes more solid, like slowly building a sturdy bridge of knowledge. But nothing is ever final. New evidence might refine or even overturn old ideas. The scientific approach is ongoing and self-correcting, always open to gentle revision as new insights emerge. Now, as you relax and listen, picture the care and patience in this approach, a methodical yet humble way of discovering truth. Psychology's scientific method gives us a way to trust what we learn about the mind, because each idea can be tested and observed by many eyes. With this calm foundation laid, we can now drift further into the wonders of the mind. Let's explore how we learn from the world around us, turning now to one of the most fundamental processes of life, learning by association. Learning by association is called associative learning, and a classic example of this is something known as classical conditioning. It sounds technical, but it's a very natural process, one that even gentle creatures like dogs experience. Imagine a calm setting, a dog in a quiet room, and each time the dog's dinner is about to be served, a bell rings, or perhaps a soft metronome ticks. At first, the bell is just a neutral sound. The dog might perk up its ears, but it doesn't mean much. Dinner, on the other hand, is a meaningful event for the dog. The food, with its enticing smell, will automatically make the dog salivate and get excited. Food is what we would call an unconditioned stimulus. Unconditioned meaning it naturally, without any learning needed, triggers a response. The dog's salivation to the food is an unconditioned response. It's reflexive, built in by nature. Now, something interesting happens over time if the bell and the food occur together consistently. Suppose every evening, right before the dog gets its meal, the soft bell chimes, ding, then food, then food. Initially, the dog salivates only when it sees or smells the food. But after enough evenings, a shift occurs. The dog starts to connect the dots in its mind. The bell always comes just before dinner. Soon, the simple sound of that gentle bell is enough to make the dog's mouth water, even before the food appears. The bell has become what we call a conditioned stimulus. Conditioned because its meaning to the dog was learned through experience, and the dog's salivation at the sound alone is now a conditioned response. A response that had to be learned, not something the dog was born doing automatically. This kind of learning was studied very famously by a scientist named Ivan Pavlov, and so we often use his experiments as the illustration. Pavlov's dogs, as they're known, taught us how animals, and people too, can learn to associate one thing with another when they happen together in time. In a sense, the bell became a signal for the dog, a little promise that food is coming next. The dog's body responded to that signal as if the food had already arrived. In our own lives, classical conditioning happens more often than we might realize, quietly shaping our likes, dislikes, and reactions. Perhaps you have a certain song that makes you feel happy because it was playing during a wonderful moment in your past. The song itself might have been neutral at first, just a tune. The happy moment was like the food, something that naturally made you feel good. After experiencing them together, the song alone can bring back that warm feeling. Or consider how the smell of a particular soap might suddenly comfort you because it reminds you of a loved one's home. The scent became associated with feelings of safety. This learning by association follows a gentle pattern. It usually takes a few pairings of the two events, the bell and the food, or the song and the happy time, before the new connection is firmly formed. This period is called acquisition, the time when the association is being acquired or learned. Interestingly, a lot of the learning tends to happen in the early pairings, and then it levels off, as if the first few times make a big impression, and after that, it's just fine-tuning. Now, what happens if the association changes? Suppose one day the bell rings and no dinner comes for the dog, and this happens again the next day. Bell, but no food. The dog might be confused at first. It salivated when it heard the bell, expecting its meal, but nothing followed. If this keeps happening, eventually the dog will learn that the bell no longer signals food. Gradually, its conditioned response, salivation to the bell, will fade away. This gentle fading is called extinction. The response isn't instantly forgotten, but with each bell that isn't followed by a meal, the dog salivates less and less, as if the memory of the association is slowly drifting off. However, even after a pause, the memory isn't completely gone. Imagine after a week of no bell at all, you ring the bell again once. The dog might still salivate a little. This is something called spontaneous recovery. It's as if the learned link was lying dormant and can briefly reappear even after it was supposed to be extinguished. But if the food truly never returns with the bell, the response will be weaker and will disappear again. This shows that the things we learn aren't simply erased. A trace remains, just in case it becomes relevant again. Our minds also have a delicate way of spreading learned associations to similar things, a process called generalization. If a dog learns to salivate to a bell of a certain tone, it might also salivate, though perhaps a bit less, to a slightly different tone, thinking it might predict dinner too. In life, if you have a positive experience with one friendly dog, you might feel good seeing a different dog later because it reminds you of the first. That's generalization, similar stimuli producing similar responses. But with time, we can also learn to tell things apart, which is called discrimination. The dog can learn that a high-pitched dinner bell means food, but a lower-pitched bell does not. And so it will salivate only to the specific tone it has learned. Likewise, you might learn that not all dogs are the same. The gentle dog at home is very different from a barking dog that scared you once, and you respond differently to each. Discrimination refines our learning, so we respond only to the relevant signals and not to just anything that vaguely resembles them. These principles of classical conditioning have been used to understand many emotional responses, including fears and phobias. A phobia is a strong, overwhelming fear of a particular situation or object, like a fear of heights or spiders, that usually goes beyond the actual danger. How might a phobia form? Often, it's through a negative association that gets deeply embedded. If someone had a frightening experience on a high balcony, say a sudden scare or fall, the height, which used to be neutral, can become linked with panic. Later, just being up high triggers that conditioned fear response. It's as if the body has learned this place signals danger. Thankfully, just as conditioning can create a phobia, understanding conditioning can help us gently ease such fears. Therapies based on classical conditioning involve breaking the association or replacing it with a new, calmer association. One approach is a gradual exposure, often called systematic desensitization. For example, if someone is afraid of heights, they might start by simply imagining being on a balcony while in a safe, relaxed setting, learning to stay calm with that image. Then maybe they look at photos taken from tall buildings, then stand on a low step, then a higher one, working upward at a comfortable pace. Each small step is paired with relaxation and nothing bad happening. So over time, the high place loses its scary association and gains a neutral or even positive one. There's also a more sudden approach, implosive therapy, where someone might confront their fear in a big way, perhaps vividly imagining their worst fear scenario under the guidance of a therapist to show that even then, panic can peak and subside and they are okay. Both methods aim to retrain the association. Heights no longer predict something awful, so the fear response fades. Classical conditioning shows us how deeply our environment and experiences can quietly shape our reactions. It's often happening without conscious effort. The dog doesn't decide to salivate, and we don't choose to feel tense when we hear a certain alarm sound that once signaled an emergency. It just happens because our mind has learned a connection. As you rest here listening, you might reflect on some associations in your own life, noticing how certain songs or scents carry you to another time or mood. It's a natural, gentle process, and being aware of it can be comforting. It reminds us that our minds are always learning, always making connections, often in ways that are meant to prepare or protect us. Now, beyond associations between events, another powerful way we learn is through the consequences of our own actions. In life, our behaviors often lead to outcomes, some good, some bad. And these outcomes feed back into whether we do those behaviors more or less in the future. This form of learning by consequences is called instrumental conditioning or operant conditioning. It's the kind of learning that answers the question, if I do this, what happens next? And does that make me want to do it more or less? Imagine a child who smiles at a stranger and the stranger gives a warm smile back. That positive response might encourage the child to smile at others again. On the other hand, if a child touches a hot stove and gets a painful burn, they quickly learn not to touch it again. In simple terms, behaviors followed by good outcomes tend to be repeated, while behaviors followed by unpleasant outcomes tend to be avoided. This idea was captured over a century ago by psychologist Edward Thorndike as the law of effect. Thorndike observed how cats learn to escape a puzzle box. If a certain action, like pressing a lever, led to freedom and a bit of food, the cats would gradually press that lever faster on each trial. The satisfying outcome, stamped in the successful behavior, making it more likely in the future. Behaviors that didn't lead to a good outcome, like clawing at the door, tended to fade away. They were stamped out. In our everyday lives, we experience these lessons constantly. We might try a new route driving to work. If it gets us there faster and with less stress, a good outcome, we're more likely to take that route again. If it was full of traffic and frustration, a bad outcome, we'll likely avoid it next time. Over time, the patterns of our actions are shaped by these little rewards and punishments from the environment. Psychologists use specific terms to talk about these consequences. A reinforcer is any outcome that makes a behavior more likely to happen again. It reinforces the behavior. Reinforcers can be things that give pleasure or satisfy a need. Primary reinforcers have intrinsic value. They address basic needs or desires. Think of food, water, or gentle affection. These are naturally rewarding. Secondary reinforcers are things that we have learned to value because they're associated with primary reinforcers. Money is a classic example, as it can buy food or comfort. Money itself isn't inherently satisfying to our biology, but we've learned its value, so it can motivate us strongly. Now, reinforcements and punishments can be given or taken away, and outcomes can be pleasant or unpleasant, leading to different effects on behavior. If something good is given after an action, that's called positive reinforcement. Positive meaning adding something. For example, you tidy up your room and your parent praises you. That added praise makes you more likely to tidy up again. If something bad or aversive is removed as a result of an action, that can also encourage behavior. That's negative reinforcement. Negative here means subtracting something, and reinforcement means the behavior is strengthened. Think of having a terrible headache, an unpleasant state, and you find that sitting quietly in a dark room makes the headache go away. You've removed the pain by a certain behavior, which reinforces that behavior. Next time you have a headache, you'll be more likely to seek out darkness and quiet. In both cases of positive and negative reinforcement, the behavior's frequency increases, either because it gained a good thing or got rid of a bad thing. On the flip side, we have punishment, which decreases the likelihood of a behavior. If an action leads to something unpleasant being given, that's positive punishment. Again, positive meaning adding something, in this case adding a negative outcome. For example, a child touches the hot stove and gets a burn. The added pain makes the child far less likely to touch the stove again. If an action results in something good being taken away, that's negative punishment. An example, a teenager stays out past curfew, so their parents take away their video game privileges for a week. The removal of something enjoyable makes it less likely the teen will break curfew again. In both punishment cases, the behavior's frequency decreases, either because it brought a bad consequence or lost a good one. It might seem like a lot of terms, positive negative reinforcement, positive negative punishment, but in practice they're intuitive because we experience them. Rewarding outcomes encourage us, and punishing outcomes deter us. It's a natural part of learning. Even simple creatures learnt this way. A mouse in a maze will quickly learn to navigate toward the section with cheese and avoid the section where it once received a mild shock. Often our behaviors aren't one-step events. Sometimes we need to learn a complex series of actions that we wouldn't just do all at once on our own. This is where techniques like shaping come in. Shaping is a gentle, step-by-step coaching process. To teach a new behavior, we reinforce any small step that's in the right direction, gradually raising the bar until the full behavior is achieved. Imagine you want to teach a shy dog to fetch a ball. The dog might not understand the whole game at first. Through shaping, you would start by rewarding any action related to the ball. Maybe you give the dog a treat just for looking at the ball. Once it's doing that reliably, you only reward when it moves a little closer to the ball. Next, reward only when it touches or sniffs the ball, then only when it picks the ball up, and finally when it brings the ball toward you. By reinforcing each successive approximation, you've gently led the dog through a complex sequence of actions that it wouldn't have figured out all at once. It's like showing the way with tiny breadcrumbs. A related idea is chaining, which is used to teach a sequence of behaviors that should happen in a specific order. Each action in the chain cues the next action. For example, consider a simple bedtime routine for a child. You might teach them to first put away their toys, then change into pajamas, then brush their teeth, then hop into bed for a story. Each step naturally leads to the next, and you might praise or reward the completion of the whole chain, like after they're all ready for bed, they get a cozy story time as a reward. In animal training, chaining is seen in something like teaching a bird to do a little performance. First ring a bell, then walk through a hoop, then stand on a perch. Each behavior is taught and linked, so the bird learns that after one action, the next one is expected, leading to a reward at the end. It's also important to note that behaviors often occur in particular contexts. In operant conditioning, a discriminative stimulus is like a green light that indicates when a certain behavior will pay off. For instance, if a child learns that asking mom for a cookie when mom is in a good mood yields a cookie, but asking when mom is busy does not, the child is picking up on the cues of mom's mood as a discriminative stimulus for the behavior of asking politely. Similarly, a pigeon in a lab might learn that pecking a key yields food only when a light is on. The light becomes the sign that now the behavior will be rewarded. It's fascinating. Even if the behavior and consequences remain the same, the context can control whether the behavior happens because we learn to read the environment for when it's appropriate or likely to succeed. Another rich area of instrumental learning is schedules of reinforcement, essentially when and how often a behavior is reinforced. It turns out that the timing and frequency of rewards can affect how quickly a behavior is learned and how long it lasts if rewards stop. If a behavior is enforced every single time it occurs, that's continuous reinforcement. This leads to quick learning, but if the reward stops, the behavior also stops fairly quickly. The learner notices the change right away. I'm not getting my treat anymore, I'll quit. On the other hand, partial, intermittent reinforcement means the behavior is reinforced only some of the time. This might slow down initial learning a bit, but it often makes the behavior much more persistent in the face of no reward, a phenomenon known as greater resistance to extinction. Essentially, if you're used to not getting a reward every time, you don't immediately get discouraged when one doesn't come. You keep trying longer, thinking sometimes it comes, maybe next time. Partial reinforcement can follow different patterns. A ratio schedule means it's based on the number of responses. For instance, a fixed ratio schedule might give a reward every 5th time the behavior happens, like a coffee shop loyalty card. Buy 4 coffees, the 5th one is free. This often causes a high rate of behavior, with a bit of a pause right after the reward. I got my free coffee. I might wait a bit before starting the count toward the next one. A variable ratio schedule provides reinforcement after an unpredictable number of responses. Maybe on average every 5 times, but sometimes the 3rd time, sometimes the 7th time, and so on. This is like a slot machine at a casino. You never know how many plays it will take to win. Variable ratios create a steady, high rate of behavior. People or animals keep responding vigorously because the next one might be the winner. In fact, gambling is a classic example of how powerful variable ratio reinforcement can be, making behaviors very resistant to extinction. Gamblers can't easily quit because maybe the next try is the jackpot. Another kind of schedule is based on time, called an interval schedule. A fixed interval schedule gives a reward for the first behavior after a set amount of time has passed. For example, if you have to check a cake in the oven in 30 minutes, you probably won't check constantly the whole time, but as the time nears 30 minutes, you start checking more frequently. Fixed intervals often produce a pattern where the behavior increases as the expected time of reward approaches, then drops off after the reward and slowly builds again. A variable interval schedule means the waiting time for reinforcement changes. You don't know how long you have to wait. This tends to produce a slow, steady behavior because the reinforcement could come at any time. Think of fishing. You might catch a fish after 5 minutes, then another not for 45 minutes, then another after 20 minutes. You just have to keep your line in the water patiently, and you'll check your rod consistently. A key takeaway is that while continuous rewards teach a behavior quickly, behaviors learned with partial reinforcement tend to last longer once rewards stop. If a dog got a treat every single time it sat on command and then suddenly treats stopped, the dog would soon stop sitting on cue. But if the dog only sometimes got a treat for sitting, it would continue to sit many more times after treats stopped, hoping perhaps the next sit brings a treat again. This has real-life parallels. Think of how people check their phones for messages. If you got a nice message every time you looked, you'd always look but stop quickly if they ceased. In reality, we check our phones a lot because occasionally there's something rewarding, a fun message, an interesting notification. That variable reinforcement keeps us checking habitually. One interesting phenomenon in operant conditioning is the over-justification effect. Sometimes if you start rewarding an activity that someone already enjoys for its own sake, it can actually diminish their intrinsic interest in it. It's as if the external reward replaces their internal motivation. For example, a child who loves drawing might draw for hours just for fun. If we start giving the child a prize or money every time they draw, the child might begin to see drawing as a means to get the reward rather than something enjoyable in itself. Later, if the rewards stop, the child might draw less than they did originally because the activity now feels less appealing without the prize. Essentially, an excessive external reward can interfere with the natural love of the activity. This teaches us that while rewards are powerful, they must be used thoughtfully. Sometimes encouraging someone with praise or a smile is better than a material reward that could change how they view what they're doing. Through instrumental conditioning, we see how behavior is an ongoing conversation with the environment. We act, the world responds, and we adjust. This kind of learning is happening all the time, often without us realizing. Whether it's training a pet with treats, guiding a child with encouragement and discipline, or just learning from the little successes and missteps of each day. As you lie here, you might think about some habits you have. Perhaps you always go back to a cafe where the staff greet you warmly because that friendliness is reinforcing, or you stop using an iron that once gave you a painful burn. Punishment taught you well. These everyday behaviors have been gently molded by reinforcement and punishment over time. Our journey continues from how we learn to how we think and solve problems. The human mind is remarkable in its ability to reason, imagine, and adapt. We often use the word intelligence to describe our overall mental capability, our capacity to learn from experience, solve problems, remember important information, and cope with life's challenges. It's not just about facts or book knowledge, it's also about flexibility in thinking and understanding. One part of reasoning is how we move between general ideas and specific instances. Deductive reasoning is like starting with a big rule and applying it to a particular case. For example, knowing that all birds have wings is a general rule, and deducing that if a sparrow is a bird, it must have wings. It's going from general to specific, a top-down approach. Inductive reasoning is the opposite, piecing together specific observations to form a general conclusion. If you observe that the sun has risen in the east every morning you remember, you might induce the general idea that the sun always rises in the east. Induction is more exploratory. We gather clues and infer a broader pattern. Both types of reasoning work together. We might induce a theory from experience and then deduce what should happen in a new situation from that theory. When solving problems, our clever minds sometimes get stuck in familiar ways of thinking. One common roadblock is called functional fixedness, our tendency to see objects as having only their usual function. If I hand you a hammer, you think of pounding nails. You might not immediately consider that the hammer could serve as a paperweight or a doorstop. Overcoming functional fixedness means seeing new uses or solutions that aren't obvious. When people manage to do that, like using a coin to tighten a screw when they can't find a screwdriver, it's often accompanied by a satisfying aha moment, as if the mind broke free from its usual label for the object. Another subtle obstacle in reasoning is something called confirmation bias. This is our tendency to seek out or notice information that supports what we already think, and to overlook or downplay evidence that might contradict us. In everyday life, If someone strongly believes that a particular diet is healthy, they might pay extra attention to stories of people who thrived on that diet and ignore reports of anyone who had trouble with it. Our minds like to confirm what we suspect. It's like having a friendly echo that repeats our beliefs back to us. This bias can lead us to form one-sided views or make errors in judgment because we aren't seeing the whole picture. Being aware of confirmation bias can help us gently challenge ourselves to consider other viewpoints or seek out information we might otherwise ignore. People have long tried to measure intelligence with things like IQ tests. If such tests are used, it's important that they be reliable, yield consistent results each time, and valid, actually measure what we consider intelligence, not something else. But intelligence is not a fixed number. It's influenced by both our genes and our environment. This is the classic nature versus nurture discussion. Nature gives us a range of potential, traits and capacities influenced by our genetic inheritance. Nurture is how the environment fills in that potential, our upbringing, education, nutrition, and life experiences. They dance together throughout our development. For example, a child might be born with a great potential for musical talent, nature, but without exposure to music or an instrument to practice on, nurture, that potential might not flourish. On the other hand, a supportive environment can often help people overcome hurdles that might run in their family. Modern understanding is that nature and nurture are deeply intertwined. Genes can even be switched on or off by environmental factors, so it's never one or the other alone. Interestingly, over the past many decades, there's been a trend of rising performance on IQ tests worldwide, known as the Flynn effect. It suggests that average scores have been going up over generations. This might reflect various environmental improvements, better nutrition, more access to education and information, or the increased complexity of modern environments that exercises our minds more. It's a reminder that what we measure as intelligence can be shaped by the world we live in and isn't static. When we think of solving problems, having knowledge and raw brain power is part of it, but how we organize what we know is also key. We use mental frameworks called schemas to make sense of the world. A schema is like a concept or blueprint in our mind for a category of things or ideas. For example, you have a schema for birthday party. It might include cake, candles, singing happy birthday, gifts, etc. When you hear birthday party, that schema activates and you have an idea of what to expect. When new information comes in, we have two main ways to fit it into our schemas. One way is assimilation. We take the new experience and interpret it in light of our existing schemas, often bending it to fit what we already know. If a child has a schema for bird that includes anything that flies and they see a butterfly, they might initially call the butterfly a bird because it flies. They're assimilating the butterfly into their bird schema. The other way is accommodation. We adjust our schema or create a new one to better fit the new information. That same child, upon noticing that a butterfly doesn't have feathers or a beak, might adjust their concept of bird to be more specific. Say birds have feathers and lay eggs, and carve out a separate schema for insect, for butterflies and the like. Through assimilation and accommodation, our understanding evolves. It's how a child's simplistic view of the world gradually becomes more nuanced. No discussion of cognitive development would be complete without mentioning Jean Piaget, who outlines stages of how children's thinking matures. First is the sensorimotor stage, 0 to 2 years old, where babies learn about the world through their senses and actions. They reach, grab, look, listen. Everything is about direct interaction with the environment. A major milestone in this stage is developing object permanence, the understanding that things continue to exist even when out of sight. In early infancy, if you hide a toy, the baby might act as if it vanished because they don't yet grasp that it's still there. But by the end of this stage, they know the toy is just hidden and can search for it. Peekaboo is endlessly entertaining to a younger baby because, to them, when your face is covered, you might truly be gone for the moment and then magically reappear. Next is the pre-operational stage, roughly ages 2 to 7. In this stage, children become better at using symbols, words, pictures, pretend play. A child might use a broom as a horse or pour an imaginary cup of tea for a teddy bear. They have lots of imagination, but their thinking is not yet logical in the adult sense. They still tend to view the world very much from their own perspective, egocentrism, and they struggle with logic on things like conservation. For example, not yet understanding that the amount of water stays the same when it's poured into a different shaped glass. If you show a child of this age 2 equal glasses of juice and then pour one into a taller, thinner glass, they'll likely insist the tall glass has more juice because the level is higher, even though they saw the quantity was equal. Their intuition overrides logical understanding at this point. Next comes the concrete operational stage, approximately 7 to 12 years. Children now become capable of logical thinking about concrete, physical things. They understand principles like conservation and can take others' perspectives much better. They can solve problems involving tangible objects and real events. For instance, they can figure out that if 3 plus 5 equals 8, then 18 of 3 must equal 5, reversibility. However, abstract or hypothetical thinking is still difficult for them. They often need direct hands-on experience to grasp a concept fully. Finally, around 12 and up, the formal operational stage emerges. Now the developing teenager can handle abstract concepts and hypothetical situations with ease. They can ponder what-if scenarios, think about principles like justice or freedom that aren't tied to a concrete object, and systematically plan and test ideas in their mind. Not everyone reaches full formal operational thinking at the same time or applies it universally, but this stage provides the tools for scientific reasoning, moral reasoning, and philosophical thought. It's worth noting that while Piaget's stages provide a helpful outline, individual development can vary. Children might advance in some areas faster than others, and sometimes they grasp a concept earlier than the stage would suggest if it's presented in a simpler way. But, in broad strokes, these stages capture the transformation from a newborn who knows the world only through sensation and action to an adolescent who can contemplate the vast possibilities of existence, truly a wondrous journey of the mind. Even as adults, when we think we're being completely rational, we often use mental shortcuts to make decisions quickly. These shortcuts are known as heuristics. They're like rules of thumb, not guaranteed to be correct, but usually good enough and much faster than analysing every detail. One common shortcut is the availability heuristic. This means we judge how likely or common something is by how easily examples come to mind. If something can be recalled quickly, perhaps because we just heard about it or it was very dramatic, we tend to think it's more frequent than it really is. For example, if you recently saw a news report about a shark attack, you might overestimate the danger of swimming in the ocean because that vivid instance is available in your memory, even though shark attacks are extremely rare. In contrast, something mundane that happens all the time, like tripping on the sidewalk, might not stand out in memory, so we underestimate how common such things are. Another shortcut is the representativeness heuristic. This involves judging the likelihood of something by how much it resembles our idea of a typical case. If I tell you about someone who is shy, loves reading, and is very organised, and then ask if this person is more likely a librarian or a postal worker, many people would instantly guess librarian because the description fits the stereotype of a librarian. We're using representativeness. The person fits our mental image of that profession. But in doing so, we might ignore base rates. There are many more postal workers than librarians, or other relevant information. Representativeness can lead to stereotyping, assuming someone belongs to a group or has certain traits just because they resemble our prototype of that group. It's a quick judgment, and sometimes it's off the mark. Recognizing that our minds use these heuristics and biases doesn't mean we won't use them. They're quite automatic, but it can help us slow down and question our first instincts when needed. It adds a gentle filter of reflection. Am I assuming this is true just because it's easy to recall or because it fits a pattern I expect? Maybe I should gather a bit more information. As you absorb these thoughts on reasoning and problem solving, you might feel appreciation for the flexibility of your own mind. We can think in stories and symbols, solve puzzles, and yet sometimes we take mental leaps or shortcuts. for the sake of efficiency. It's all part of being human, a blend of careful thought and intuitive snap judgments. Having explored language, an essential cognitive ability, let's now consider how we make sense of the things around us by grouping them into categories and concepts, continuing our calm journey. Our minds are constantly organizing the world, even when we don't realize it. One way we do this is by forming categories and concepts. A category is a set of things that we consider equivalent in some way, and a concept is our mental understanding of that category. Categorization helps us navigate the world without being overwhelmed by details. Why do we categorize? For one, it lets us simplify and make predictions. If you see a new type of chair, you immediately know it's for sitting because you have the concept chair in your mind. You don't need to examine it from scratch to decide what to do with it. Categorization also helps with communication. We can use one word, like fruit, to refer to a whole group of items, apples, bananas, cherries, without having to list every example each time. It's a mental shortcut that packs lots of information into a single label. Even very young children and animals show the ability to form categories. Infants can recognize that although a Dalmatian and a beagle look different, they're both dogs. Experiments have shown that babies young as a few months old can form concepts like dog versus cat. Pigeons have been taught to peck one button if a picture shows a tree, and a different button if it shows a body of water. They learned the categories tree and water. What's interesting is that categorization doesn't necessarily require language. It's a more basic cognitive ability. Language, however, can refine our categories and allow us to handle very abstract ones. Sometimes because we're so good at categorizing, we don't realize how complex it is. We have what's called the illusion of the expert for familiar tasks. If something is easy for us, we might assume it's simple in general. For instance, as an adult, you effortlessly know what counts as a chair. But if someone asked you to define chair in a precise way that includes all chairs and excludes non-chairs, you might stumble. A chair usually has 4 legs, but a beanbag doesn't, and it's a kind of chair. A chair is for sitting, but you can sit on a bench without a back, which might or might not be considered a chair. You realize the concept of chair is a bit fuzzy at the edges, even though in practice you have no trouble identifying one. The illusion of the expert is feeling that because you find it easy, having had years of experience with chairs, it must be easy for everyone, when in fact defining it clearly is hard, and for a young child, even recognizing different styles of chairs as all being chairs is a learning process. How do we decide what fits into a category? Psychologists have a couple of theories. One is the prototype theory. This suggests that for each category, our mind has a kind of best example or average, a prototype. When we see a new object, we compare it to our prototype. The closer it is, the more confidently we say it's part of that category. For example, think of the category bird. Perhaps your prototype bird is something like a sparrow. Small brown flies, sings. Now consider a robin and a penguin. A robin matches the sparrow-like prototype quite well. Similar size, it flies, it sings, so you instantly recognize it as a bird. A penguin, on the other hand, is quite different from your prototypical bird. It's large, black and white, doesn't fly, waddles, swims. You'll still classify a penguin as a bird, you know it biologically is one. But it might take a tiny bit more thought, or at least it feels like an odd bird. That's prototype theory at work. A robin is a very birdy bird, whereas a penguin is an unusual bird. Another approach is the exemplar theory. Instead of one prototype, this theory says we store many specific examples, exemplars, of category members in memory. When we encounter a new item, we compare it to all the examples we can recall and see if it matches or is similar to them. So for bird, you might remember many birds you've seen: sparrows, robins, eagles, pigeons, maybe pictures of ostriches or penguins. The new creature in front of you is classified as a bird if it reminds you of those known birds. It doesn't have to match one abstract prototype closely. It just needs to be sufficiently similar to some of the birds in your memory. If you grew up in a place with lots of pigeons and seagulls, your idea of bird might be tuned to those, and you'll judge new animals by similarity to them. As you encounter more kinds of birds, you enrich your collection of exemplars. which can make you more flexible in recognizing atypical birds, like once you've seen pictures of ostriches or emus, a penguin might not seem so strange a bird after all. Both prototype and exemplar approaches have merit, and our minds might use a mix of both. Early in learning, we might rely more on exemplars because we haven't abstracted a prototype yet. As we become more experienced, we form a prototype but also remember many specific examples. Children's understanding of categories also reveals interesting things. By age 3 or 4, children start to grasp that categories of living things have an underlying essence that isn't easily changed. For example, they recognize that painting a raccoon to look like a skunk doesn't actually turn it into a skunk. The raccoon is still a raccoon inside, but they readily see that a teapot painted like a birdhouse is now, functionally, a birdhouse. This suggests that even young kids have different expectations for natural kinds, animals, plants, which they feel have some core identity, versus artifacts, man-made things which can be changed or repurposed. To a child, a machine or a toy is defined by how it's used, and changing its shape or purpose changes what it is. But an animal has an inherent identity that superficial changes won't alter. Categorization is generally very useful, but it can also lead us astray if our categories are wrong or too rigid. Stereotypes about people are essentially categories that might be based on a grain of truth or completely erroneous, yet they can color our expectations. A gentle approach is to remember that while our brain likes to categorize quickly, we can always update our categories with new information or decide to treat individuals as unique without leaning too hard on labels. As you lie here, you might appreciate how your mind has sorted countless bits of knowledge into neat categories, so you don't have to relearn what every single thing is, every single day. A cup is a cup, whether it's a mug or a teacup or made of glass. You know what to do with it. This ability frees up mental energy for us to focus on other things, to be creative, or to pay attention to finer details when needed. From organizing our thoughts, let's move to how we focus our thoughts. Every day, our senses take in far more than our mind can fully process. Attention is like a spotlight or a filter that selects what will be in the forefront of our consciousness at any moment. When you pay attention to one thing, many other things recede into the background. We can think of attention as having two modes. Sometimes it's automatic and sometimes it's controlled. Automatic processes are those that grab our attention without any conscious effort. If a balloon pops loudly or someone calls your name, you probably will look over immediately. It's reflexive, your attention is captured by the event. These automatic attentional responses are usually fast and based on something salient. Maybe a sudden movement, a bright flash, a loud noise, or something emotionally significant like your name or a crying sound. They're our mind's way of ensuring we notice important or potentially important things in our environment. Controlled attention, on the other hand, is when we deliberately focus on something. Imagine you're reading a book in a busy cafe. You might tune out the background chatter and truly concentrate on the words. That takes mental effort. Controlled attention is slower and under your conscious direction. You might even feel it as a kind of strain if the environment is distracting, like actively holding the beam of a flashlight steady on one spot despite winds or shaking. Because controlled attention has a limited capacity, we cannot easily focus deeply on two things at once. You might think you're multitasking when you toggle between writing a message and watching a TV show, but in truth, your attention is switching rapidly back and forth. Each switch can make your attention a bit less effective. That's why, for example, talking on the phone while driving can be dangerous. Even if you feel like you're doing both, your brain is really juggling and it might miss something important on the road during a moment of focus on the conversation. Certain things are salient, meaning they naturally stand out and capture attention. Bright colours, strong contrasts, loud sounds, or a unique object in a scene all draw our eyes and ears. This is why emergency vehicles have flashing lights and sirens. They hijack your automatic attention so you notice them immediately. It's also why, say, a red apple in a green tree catches your eye. Our brains are tuned to notice differences and changes because often those could be important. A predator moving in the bushes, for example, or thunder in the distance. One helpful metaphor for attention is a spotlight. Imagine a dark room filled with all sorts of objects and events. Your attention is like a beam of light illuminating one area. Within that area, things are bright, detailed, and clear to you. Outside that beam, things are dim or not perceived at all. You can move the spotlight around. Sometimes you do so willingly, and other times something jerks it in a direction. When you're deeply engrossed in thought, it's like your spotlight is turned inward, and you might not notice someone walking into the room or speaking to you at first. There have been many studies of how we filter information. An early idea was that we have a single channel, like a bottleneck, and only the important stuff gets through. One famous example is the cocktail party effect. Imagine you're at a lively cocktail party with multiple conversations buzzing around. You're talking to someone and focusing on that conversation, managing to tune out other voices. According to early theories, you might be doing this by filtering based on physical characteristics. You're listening to the person in front of you and not the others, almost as if your brain's ear is only open to that voice and closed to the rest. Indeed, for the most part, you won't recall what others nearby were talking about. But there's a twist. If someone across the room says your name or something highly relevant to you, you may notice it instantly, even though you weren't paying attention to that conversation. This suggests that your brain was doing a lighter monitoring of unattended input. To explain this, a later theory proposed that we have not one but two stages of filtering. First, an early quick filter based on basic features, like voices, pitch, or direction, that decides what to focus on primarily, and then a second filter that can catch meaningful things that slip through in the background at a lower volume, so to speak. In our cocktail party example, your primary attention was on your friend's voice, but your own name, even spoken softly elsewhere, is so meaningful to you that it passed the secondary filter and grabbed your spotlight. A classic task to demonstrate the interplay of automatic and controlled attention is the Stroop task. In this task, you see words that name colours, like red or blue, but they might be printed in a different colour ink. For example, the word red might be printed in blue ink. The challenge is to name the ink colour while ignoring the word itself. This turns out to be difficult when the word and ink don't match, an incongruent condition. If you see red printed in blue, your brain automatically wants to read the word red. Reading is such a practiced skill that it happens without effort. But you're supposed to say blue. There's a conflict between the automatic process, reading the word, and the controlled task, naming the ink colour. You'll likely pause a moment or even say the wrong thing, maybe blurt red instead of blue. It takes mental effort to overcome the automatic impulse to read. This shows how some processes in our mind, like reading for a literate adult, are so ingrained that they proceed without our intention and can even interfere with tasks we are trying to do intentionally. We also use attention in visual searches, looking for something in our field of view. If you've ever played hidden picture games or tried to find your friend in a crowd, you're familiar with how attention can scan the environment. Often, a target with a unique single feature, like a red apple among green apples, or your friend wearing a bright yellow coat in a sea of grey ones, will pop out, catching your attention instantly. It doesn't really matter how many items are in the scene. Your friend in the yellow coat is immediately noticeable because that colour is unique there. That's called a feature search. You're searching for one distinct feature. However, if what you're looking for shares features with other things around, it gets trickier. Suppose you're looking for your friend who you recall is wearing a grey coat, but many people are wearing grey, and you have to also notice their face or height. Now you're looking for a combination of features, say grey coat plus a certain height, a certain hairstyle. This is called a conjunction search because it involves a conjunction of features, and it usually takes longer, especially as the number of people increases. You might have to examine people one by one until you spot all the features together. Your attention can't just grab it in one go, because no single feature screams, "Here I am!" You have to look for a particular combination. Context also matters in searching. If you know roughly where something is, or what usual context it appears in, your attention will be guided by that memory. For instance, if you always keep your keys on the right side of your desk, when you look for them, you'll direct your gaze there first and often find them immediately if they're there. This is sometimes called contextual cueing. The context cues you where to focus attention efficiently. Our brains subconsciously learn patterns. Perhaps you've noticed that in a certain puzzle book, Waldo is often hiding near the beach scenes, so you start by scanning those areas. Context and experience help your attention become more strategic. Overall, attention is about managing limited mental resources. It's the gentle art of focusing on what seems most important at any given moment and filtering out the rest. You can only hold a few items in the bright spotlight of awareness at once. Right now, it might be the sound of this narration and perhaps the feeling of your head on the pillow. Everything else, the particulars of the room, any distant noises, can fade away. This selective focus helps you process those chosen things deeply without distraction. And in a relaxed setting like now, you can allow your spotlight to narrow to just the soothing sound and meaning of these words, letting them guide you into a peaceful state. Now we arrive at the topic of memory, the mind's storehouse of experience and knowledge. Memory is what allows us to hold on to the things we've learned, the people we've met, the joys and lessons of life. Without memory, each morning would truly be a blank slate, and we'd constantly be starting over. But with it, our past guides our present. Memory isn't one single process, it involves several stages. First, there's encoding. This is when we first take in information and convert it into a form that our brain can store. You might encode by listening, like now, by looking, or by mentally summarizing an idea. Next comes storage, keeping that encoded information in the brain over time. And finally, retrieval, accessing the stored information when we need it later. Sometimes forgetting happens because the information wasn't encoded well, like a name you didn't catch when you were introduced, or because it didn't get stored properly, perhaps due to lack of attention or sleep, or because you just can't retrieve it at the moment. It's on the tip of your tongue, but the cue isn't right. One helpful thing for retrieval is using retrieval cues. These are like triggers that help bring a memory to mind. If I ask you to remember what you had for dinner last night, the question itself is a cue. Sometimes cues are more indirect. A particular smell might remind you of your grandmother's house, or hearing a few notes of an old song might suddenly bring back where you were and who you were with when that song played years ago. Our memories are connected to the context in which we formed them. This idea is known as encoding specificity. Memories are more easily retrieved when the context at recall matches the context during encoding. That's why you might find it easier to recall biology facts in your classroom where you learned them than in a random setting. It's also why revisiting your childhood hometown can unlock a flood of long-forgotten memories. The sights, sounds, and smells are cues that reach stored experiences. Our brains use strategies to hold on to more information, especially in the short term. One such strategy is chunking. Because our immediate memory has a limited capacity, often cited as about 7-2 items, grouping information into larger meaningful chunks allows us to remember more. A classic example is remembering a long number by breaking it into chunks. Instead of 1945203, you might think 1945 2023, treating each year as one item rather than 4 separate digits. By binding pieces together into a unit, you effectively increase how much you can keep in mind. We do this naturally with language. We remember phrases or ideas rather than every letter individually, and with many learned patterns. Now, let's consider different types of memory. Sensory memory is the very brief preservation of sensory information. It's like an echo or a snapshot that lasts only a split second after the actual stimulus. If you ever watch a sparkler and see a trail of light, that's your iconic sensory memory holding on to the light's image just a moment as it fades. If someone says something to you and you say, "What?" but then a second later you realize what they said before they even repeat it, that's your echoic auditory memory. The sound persisted in your mind for a moment, allowing you to rehear it. Sensory memory has a large capacity. It momentarily holds everything your senses just took in. but an extremely short duration, only fractions of a second for vision, and a few seconds for hearing typically. Information we pay attention to moves into short-term memory, which is a temporary holding place for information we're actively thinking about. Modern theories often refer to working memory to emphasize that this isn't just storage, but also a workspace where we can manipulate information. Working memory is like your mind's notepad or scratch pad. You use it to do mental arithmetic, to follow a conversation, to remember a new phone number just long enough to dial it. It's limited in capacity, hence the chunking trick, and duration. Without rehearsal, items fade within tens of seconds. Working memory has subsystems, one for verbal or sound information, like repeating a sentence to yourself, and one for visual spatial information, like picturing a map or a pattern, with a central manager that directs attention and coordinates tasks. In essence, working memory is the active workspace where you hold and manipulate information briefly, and it's critical for reasoning and learning in the moment. Finally, there's long-term memory, which is more like a vast library of everything we've experienced and learned over the years. Long-term memory can last from minutes to a lifetime. It doesn't mean everything is always accessible, but it's stored in some form. Long-term memories can be explicit or implicit. Explicit declarative memories are those we can consciously recall and talk about. Facts, events, knowledge of the world. Within this, we often distinguish between semantic memory, general knowledge, and facts, like Paris is the capital of France, or the meaning of the word gravity, and episodic memory, personal experiences, like your memory of your last birthday, which has a where and when associated with it. Recalling an episodic memory can feel like reliving a moment, while recalling a semantic memory is more like just knowing something. Implicit, non-declarative memories are those that influence our behavior without conscious recall. These include things like skills and habits, often called procedural memory. For example, you likely have to consciously remember how to ride a bicycle each time you just get on and do it. That skill is stored as memory, but you might find it hard to put into words exactly how you balance and pedal. It's an implicit knowledge in your body. Other implicit memories involve conditioning and priming, our unconscious tendencies and biases shaped by past experiences, like feeling uneasy on a particular street without recalling that you once had a frightening experience there, or finding a puzzle easier the second time, even if you don't remember doing it before. Memory has some intriguing quirks. For instance, when recalling a list of items, people often show a pattern called the serial position effect. They remember the first few items, primacy effect, and the last few items, recency effect, better than those in the middle. The primacy effect likely occurs because the first items had a chance to be rehearsed more or transferred to long-term memory. The recency effect happens because the last items are still in short-term memory at the time of recall. If there's a delay or distraction before recall, the recency effect can fade, since short-term memory of them fades. But the primacy effect, those that made it to long-term, may still be there. Memory, though powerful, is not like a flawless video recording of our lives. It's constructive. We rebuild memories from pieces each time we recall them, which means they can change or even incorporate misinformation. For example, if you witness an event and later hear others describe it differently, your memory might merge with those accounts. People can even develop false memories, confident recollections of events that never happened, or details that are incorrect. One example of memory's fallibility is the false fame effect. After reading a list of unfamiliar names, people later tend to mistakenly identify some of those names as belonging to famous people, simply because the names sound familiar. The mind misattributes that familiarity to fame since it doesn't recall the true source, seeing it on a list earlier. This shows how our memory for whether we encountered something and where or when can be weaker than our memory of the thing itself. We remember the name, but not why it's familiar, and our brain fills in the gap with a reasonable guess. Perhaps I heard it as a celebrity. Our memory is strengthened when we engage deeply with information. If you think about the meaning of something or relate it to other knowledge, you're more likely to remember it than if you just glance at it or repeat it without thought. In other words, the more meaningfully we process something, the sturdier the memory becomes. For instance, learning a new term by using it in a sentence or connecting it to a concept you already know will usually lodge it in memory better than simply reading the definition 5 times. As you rest and drift, think kindly of your memories. Your first day of school, a favorite holiday, the face of a dear friend, all these live within you, accessible through that remarkable process of recall. And even if sometimes you can't immediately remember a name or fact, trust that it often will come back to you after a while, or when prompted by the right cue, like when you relax and stop straining for it, it pops into mind, a common experience. Your memories are part of what make you you, providing continuity from moment to moment and year to year. Our journey through the mind now moves from the individual inward processes to how we understand and interact with other people. Humans are profoundly social, and much of our thought is dedicated to people, how we perceive them, what we think of ourselves, and how we all influence one another. When we observe someone's behavior, we naturally wonder why they did what they did. In psychology, an explanation we come up with for someone's behavior is called an attribution. For example, imagine you saw a coworker snap sharply at another person. You might think, oh, they must be a very irritable, angry person. That would be an internal attribution, also called dispositional, attributing the behavior to something about their personality or disposition. On the other hand, you might think, maybe they snapped because they're under a lot of stress, or someone really provoked them. That would be an external attribution, situational, blaming the circumstances for the behavior. We often make these attribution judgments quickly. There are a few subtle cues we use, even if we don't realize it. One is consensus. Do others act the same in this situation? If everyone was snapping during that tense meeting, you'd be more likely to say the situation, the meeting environment, was causing it. If only your coworker snapped and everyone else was calm, you lean more towards it being something about your coworker. Another cue is distinctiveness. Does this person act differently in other situations? If your coworker is calm and friendly in all other contexts and only loses their cool in meetings, maybe it's something particular about meetings, like they have an issue with how meetings are run, still more situational. If they snap at people all the time across various contexts, then it starts to seem like that's just who they are. A third cue is consistency. Does this person always act this way in this kind of situation? If your coworker snapped just this once in a blue moon, you might chalk it up to a bad day, unusual situation. If they do it every meeting, it's consistent, and combined with low consensus and low distinctiveness, they're the only ones snapping and they do it in meetings specifically but consistently, you'd likely say that's just how they handle meetings, which could be partly dispositional. Maybe they have a short fuse in professional settings. Even without analysing it like this formally, your mind often senses these patterns. However, we all have a common bias known as the fundamental attribution error. This is the tendency to attribute other people's actions too much to their character and not enough to their situation. If a stranger on the street bumps into you and rushes off without apologising, your gut reaction might be, "How rude!" attributing it to them being an inconsiderate person. You might not immediately think perhaps they're rushing to an emergency, or maybe they didn't even notice because they were distraught. We have a sort of default assumption that behaviour reflects personality, at least for others. Interestingly, when it comes to ourselves, especially if it's negative behaviour, we often do the opposite. This is called the actor-observer effect. We know our own context and motivations, so we tend to attribute our missteps to the situation. If I bump into someone, I'm quick to think, oops, I was distracted because I'm late to pick up my child, rather than I'm a rude person. So for us as actors, circumstances loom larger, but for others as observers, their character stands out to us. It's a perspective difference. Similarly, we have a self-serving bias in attributions about ourselves. For good outcomes, we prefer internal attributions. If I ace an exam, I'm likely to think I'm smart or I studied hard. crediting my ability or effort. But for bad outcomes, we lean to external attributions. If I fail, I might say the test was unfair or I was unlucky, rather than questioning my ability or effort. This serves to protect our self-esteem. Most of us naturally do this to some extent. It keeps us feeling positive about ourselves. Another interesting aspect of our self-perception is sometimes called the above-average effect. If you ask a room of people, how many of you are above-average drivers? Typically, a majority will raise their hands. Statistically, they can't all be above average. Likewise, many of us think we're above average in intelligence, sense of humor, or other desirable traits. It's mathematically impossible for most people to be above the median on any given trait, but we tend to evaluate ourselves more generously. It's a comforting bias, a little positive illusion. Of course, realistically, we all have areas we're average or below average in, and that's perfectly fine. But our self-view often has a bit of a rosy tint. Now think about attraction and liking. What draws us to some people more than others? One big factor is proximity, being physically or functionally close to someone. People who live in the same neighborhood, work in the same office, or attend the same class have many opportunities to interact, and mere repeated interaction often breeds liking. There's something called the mere exposure effect. Simply encountering someone or something repeatedly tends to increase our liking for it, as long as the initial encounter wasn't extremely negative. A song you hear on the radio several times might grow on you. Similarly, that classmate you see every day might become more likable over time as they become more familiar. Proximity also increases the chances of meaningful exchanges and discovering commonalities, which can spark friendship or romance. Familiarity, thus, is comforting. We are social beings who generally find something reassuring in the known versus the unknown. Just think of traveling in a foreign country and then meeting someone from your own country. Instantly, you feel a bit more at ease with them because they're familiar in some way. Physical appearance can also play a role. That's the factor of physical attractiveness. It's not that looks are the most important thing, but they are often the first thing we notice. And due to a phenomenon called the halo effect, we tend to assume that if someone is attractive, they have other good qualities too, like being kind, interesting, or competent. It's a kind of cognitive shortcut. Pleasant appearance equals pleasant person, which isn't necessarily true, but it's a bias many of us have to some degree. Attractive people often receive friendlier reactions initially, which can make them appear more sociable, sometimes a self-fulfilling aspect of the halo. However, as we get to know people, appearance matters less and their actual personality shines through. Still, in first impressions, that halo effect can influence how a relationship or interaction begins. Another factor is reciprocity of liking. We tend to like people who believe like us. If you get the sense that someone really enjoys your company and thinks well of you, it's hard not to warm up to them. It just feels good to be valued, and we naturally gravitate toward those positive vibes. Interestingly, the effect can be especially strong when someone's opinion of us changes from not so good to good. If you learn that a co-worker who seemed distant at first now considers you a friend, you'll probably feel quite fond of them, sometimes even more so than someone who liked you from the start. We treasure the hard-won approval because it feels like an achievement or an authentic recognition of who we are. Conversely, if someone goes from liking us to disliking us, that can hurt more than if they never liked us at all. Similarity is another friend to attraction. We often feel closer to people who are similar to us in background, values, or interests. It's comfortable to have shared experiences or viewpoints, as it reduces conflict and provides things to bond over. If you find out someone loves the same obscure music you do or grew up in the same town, that commonality can spark a quick connection. It's not that we need to be identical. Sometimes differences complement each other well, but having core similarities, or at least a shared understanding, makes relationships smoother in many cases. All these factors, proximity, familiarity, attractiveness, reciprocal liking, similarity, act together in complex ways for any given relationship. They set the stage for interactions, which then develop through communication, empathy, and mutual experiences. As we consider how we feel about others, we also consider how others influence our behavior. The mere presence of people can change what we do. For instance, when others are watching or working alongside us, it can lead to social facilitation. If you're doing something you're skilled at, say, playing a well-practiced piano piece, an audience might energize you to perform even better. The presence of others increases your physiological arousal a bit, in a good way for easy or practiced tasks. But for something you find difficult or are still learning, an audience might make you more nervous and actually worsen your performance, social inhibition. So you might find you stumble more on a new piano piece in front of people than you would practice it alone. The effect of others depends on the task and how confident we are in it. We also learn by watching others, which is social learning. We touched on this earlier. Children and adults often imitate what they see others do, especially if those others are people they respect or if the behavior seems to be rewarded. The famous Bobo doll experiment by Bandura demonstrated that children who saw an adult behave aggressively toward a doll were more likely to later act aggressively toward the same doll. This modeling effect shows why role models and environments are so important. We soak up behaviors and norms from those around us, often without realizing. If you grow up in a household where everyone speaks softly and kindly, you likely will adopt that communication style. If you're in a work culture where staying late is the norm, you'll probably do the same because everyone around you models that behavior and it's implicitly rewarded, or at least expected. We all exist within groups: family, friends, colleagues, communities, and groups exert influence. There are social norms, unwritten rules about how to behave, and we usually conform to them to some extent. There are two main reasons for conformity. One is normative influence. We want to fit in and be liked, or at least not be rejected by the group. So we might go along with something outwardly, even if privately we disagree, just to avoid rocking the boat or being the odd one out. The other reason is informational influence. Sometimes we assume the group knows better than we do, especially in ambiguous situations. If everyone else in your friend group is raving about a movie as you walk out of the theatre and you're unsure how you felt, you might incline to say, yes, it was really good, trusting their judgment or not wanting to appear out of touch. Or if you're at a fancy dinner and you don't know which fork to use, you'll watch others and do what they do, assuming they have the correct knowledge. Group influence can also change how risky or cautious our decisions are. It was found that groups sometimes make decisions that are more extreme than the average of their individual members' decisions, a process known as group polarization. If individuals in a group start out slightly in favor of something, after discussing it, they might end up strongly in favor, collectively pushing each other to a more extreme stance. Conversely, if individuals start slightly opposed, the group discussion might make them strongly opposed. This happens because group members hear new arguments supporting the initial lean, and they also get validation from each other, which can make their views more extreme. A potentially negative group dynamic is groupthink. This occurs in highly cohesive groups with strong leaders, where there's pressure for unanimity and maintaining harmony at the expense of realistic appraisal. In groupthink, dissenting opinions are suppressed, nobody wants to be the one to break the consensus, and critical thinking is diminished. The group might make a flawed decision because they didn't fully consider warnings or alternatives. They were too focused on being in agreement. Historical fiascos in politics and business have sometimes been attributed to groupthink, where advisors were too intimidated or loyal to voice concerns, and everyone became overconfident in a plan without proper critique. Sometimes being in a group can lead individuals to put in less effort. This is known as social loafing. If you've ever been on a team project where some people coasted along, assuming others would do the heavy lifting, you've witnessed this. When individual contributions aren't directly visible or measured, some people might slack more than they would if they were working alone. It's not always conscious laziness, it can just be a diffusion of effort. There are many of us, someone will cover it. To counteract social loafing, groups often assign specific responsibilities or make individual contributions identifiable which encourages everyone to do their part. Speaking of diffusion, recall the bystander effect we mentioned earlier. In a group setting, personal responsibility can diffuse to the point that nobody acts. If one person witnesses someone needing help, that person knows it's up to them to do something. But if a dozen people witness it, each might hesitate, thinking perhaps another person will intervene, or perhaps it's not an emergency since no one else is acting. Pluralistic ignorance. Unfortunately, this can lead to no help being given at all. Understanding this effect is actually a bit empowering. It means if you ever see someone in need in a public setting, you can consciously override the hesitation by remembering that others might be in pluralistic ignorance or assuming someone else will help. By taking initiative, you often prompt others to action as well, breaking the spell, so to speak. Finally, let's consider obedience and authority. Humans often obey those they perceive as authority figures, sometimes even when it conflicts with their personal conscience. The classic studies by Stanley Milgram in the 1960s showed that average people would deliver what they believed were painful, even dangerous electric shocks to another person, just because an experimenter in a lab coat calmly instructed them to continue as part of a study. A majority of participants continued to obey to very high shock levels, even as the person, an actor, screamed in pain, simply saying things like, "The experiment requires you to continue." This was startling evidence of how powerful authority influence can be. The situation and the symbols of authority, the lab setting, the white coat, the firm instructions, led people to override their own distress and better judgment. Factors that increased or decreased obedience included the physical presence of the authority. People were more obedient when the experimenter was in the room than when giving orders by phone. And the proximity of the victim. Participants were less obedient when they had to physically touch the person to administer the shock, and more obedient when the victim was in another room unseen. It seemed easier for people to obey harmful instructions when the human consequences were less visible and the authority's presence was strong. Another famous and dark example of situational influence is the Stanford prison experiment conducted by Philip Zimbardo. In that study, college students were randomly assigned to be either guards or prisoners in a simulated prison environment in the Stanford Psychology Building's basement. The students playing guards quickly began to act cruelly and abusively, far beyond what they might do in ordinary life. Being in a powerful group role and feeling anonymous, hiding behind uniforms and mirrored sunglasses, led them to lose their sense of personal responsibility and restraint. It's an extreme example, showing how even good people can do harmful things under certain group conditions. When individuals are de-individuated, meaning they feel less like separate individuals, either because they're in a crowd in uniform or their identity is masked, their behavior can become more impulsive and aligned with the group's norms of the moment, even if those norms are destructive. It's like the normal self-checks and inhibitions weaken when everyone's doing it and you're just one of the crowd. On a more hopeful note, understanding these influences can help society set checks and encourage people to stand up against negative pressures. It only takes one person to break a unanimous wrong decision to give courage to others to dissent as well. We also value individuals who can maintain their principles even under pressure. They become inspirations for others. Let's not forget positive social influence. Kindness and generosity can also spread by example. If one person starts helping or stands up for someone, others often join in, sometimes called the hero effect. One person's bravery inspires another's. Good leaders can bring out the best in a group, fostering cooperation, creativity, and altruism, just as bad ones can bring out the worst. We also see social influence in persuasion, how our attitudes can be shaped by others' messages. There are many techniques and factors in persuasion. If someone is trying to persuade you of something serious and you're paying full attention, they'll likely be more effective with central appeals, well-reasoned arguments, facts, and a fair discussion of the issue. If you're not as engaged or the issue is as important to you, peripheral appeals might sway you more. These are things like the attractiveness or charisma of the speaker, the emotional music in an advertisement, or a simple slogan. For example, a political debate with in-depth arguments is a central route to persuasion, whereas a catchy campaign jingle or a celebrity endorsement is a peripheral route. Certain characteristics of the communicator affect persuasion too. We tend to be more persuaded by people we find credible, knowledgeable, and trustworthy, similar to us. We relate to them, or physically attractive, the halo effect in action. The way the message is delivered matters. Eye contact, confidence, a moderate speaking pace. These subtleties can increase effectiveness. The context and mood also play roles. Good news or messages that aren't too fearful often persuade more easily than heavy, threatening messages, unless the fear appeal is coupled with clear ways to avoid the threat. In wrapping up this section, it's wonderful to acknowledge how interconnected we all are. Our behavior and thoughts are not formed in isolation. We reflect and absorb a part of everyone we've met and every group we've been in. Just as one candle can light another without losing its own flame, one kind or brave act can spark another in someone else, and ideas spread from mind to mind. We influence and are influenced, usually in ways so subtle we don't even notice the sway. As our exploration draws to a close, you can feel any remaining thoughts floating gently away. We have quietly wandered through the landscapes of the mind, from learning how a simple sound can make a dog's tail wag with anticipation, to understanding how a kind word from a friend can warm your heart. We talked about how our brains take in the world, focus on what matters, and store precious memories of experiences and knowledge. We've seen that we learn not only from books, but from the people around us, imitating what we see and being uplifted by those we love. Think back ever so softly to the journey, how associations form, how practicing something many times can make it second nature, how a familiar lullaby can bring comfort because of a tender memory attached to it. Recall that our minds develop from curious infants into thoughtful adults, passing through stages of growth and wonder. Remember that language, with all its words and rules, blossomed naturally in us as we grew, allowing us to share our dreams and feelings. And memory, that quiet library inside us, holds the story of our life, ready to play a soothing highlight reel when we reminisce. We noted how we perceive others, sometimes a bit imperfectly, but often with warmth and the desire to understand. We found that simply being together, even in silence, connects us and shapes us in subtle ways. Through it all, one theme emerges. We are always learning, always adapting, and always connected to our past, to our surroundings, and to each other. Now there is nothing more you need to do and nowhere else you need to be. You can let your mind drift, knowing it has gently absorbed what is meaningful to you tonight. The knowledge will settle in like sand at the bottom of a clear lake, calm and in its place. Any questions or curiosities can fade for now, trusting that they will arise again when needed, and that your mind will be ready for them after it's had its rest. Feel the tranquility in your body. Your breathing is soft and steady. With each exhale, release any lingering tension. With each inhale, invite peace and comfort. The world of psychology, neuroscience, and behavior will be here for you whenever you wish to wander through it again. For now, you can let it all go, secure in the understanding that your subconscious mind can hold it for you. You have done enough for today. It's time to let go of these words and float into a deep, restful sleep. All is well. You are safe, you are loved, and you are at ease. Allow the silence between the thoughts to widen, like a gentle twilight spreading across the sky of your mind. Thank you for listening and learning in this quiet way. Let your eyes gently close, your muscles relax, and your thoughts grow beautifully dim. Wishing you a peaceful night and the sweetest of dreams. Good night.